looking at public space and people and thinking about public spaces as a form of heritage and people and their relationship to society. And I'm going to do this by doing a very detailed deep dive into one single site for the next, I suppose, 45 minutes or so. And that's looking at Federation Square in Melbourne. And this is a site that has interested me for a long time, since it opened a little over 20 years ago, but particularly in some more recent events that related to the intersection of heritage regimes and heritage systems with this relatively new and controversial site. Before continuing, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on a range of Indigenous country today, and me in particular, I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri Wurrung of the East Kulin Nations, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. And I do so with this slide of Federation Square and the 10 Darum, which is a coming together of the Kulin Nations, which now is an annual event at the site, and was the re-emergence about a decade ago through the Melbourne Festival of the continuance of cultural practice that had stopped at the time with colonisation and the attempted destruction of Indigenous culture, which thankfully failed. So just very briefly, that's me. I'm a historian, heritage specialist and academic. I have a website, jameslesh.au, and a blog as well, where I post all the different things that I'm looking at and interested in. It's called history or heritage.city. A couple of the books that I've worked on, my monograph, Values in Cities, Urban Heritage in 20th Century Australia, as well as the very long titled Look at People-Centred Heritage as well. And I include another couple of publications there, which is an academic article I published in Fabrications, a journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, Australia and New Zealand, which looks at Melbourne's Federation Square and its heritage discontents between 94 and 2002. And about half of the lecture today comes from that article, and the other half is a reflection and a more sort of personal account of a heritage campaign I was involved in with this fantastic group of lovely and intelligent people on the top right, us at Federation Square, where we campaigned for a heritage listing when the site was under threat and strain of development that was inconsistent with its heritage values. And for that, we won an award, which was cool. And I'll talk a lot more about that a little bit later. So let's start with the kind of social and legislative and government context for heritage in Victoria. So in the Victorian context, as with every state in Australia, we have a state heritage system. It's constituted under the Heritage Act 2017, relatively new act, although it hasn't really changed very much in a number of decades. Section 1, paragraph A, it provides for the protection and conservation of the cultural heritage of the state. So, and then it creates a heritage council and arranges systems and processes for administrating that very grand objective. We also have at the local level, local heritage, and that's a section of the Planning and Environment Act 1987 in Victoria, a very old act, which a lot of people are talking about now because of housing and other issues. And it includes as one of its objectives, under Section 4, to conserve and enhance those buildings, areas, or other places which are of scientific, aesthetic, architectural, or historical interest, or otherwise of special cultural values. And it would be through both state and local heritage that Federation Square would intercept in various ways over an extended period of time for a number of reasons related specifically to Federation Square, but also what was at the site before and what kind of still exists at the site today in terms of its longer history. The other thing to think about is the regimes or processes of heritage, best practice heritage. And for that, we have the Barra Charter, the Australian Commonwealth Charter for the Places of Cultural Significance, the most recent version being 2013. And I suppose the Barra Charter might be familiar to many of you, given its, I'm sure you'll explore in future studies and in industry, as well as sort of best practice conservation in Australia. And really what I'm interested in is the relationship between heritage regimes and processes and the community and public space, and looking at how those relationships interfaces. I think it's also very interesting because, of course, the heritage systems are a product of society, but they and communities and people, but they sort of sit a little bit separately nowadays. And I'm going to use the notion of heritage value or cultural value as a kind of rubric for the paper, for the talk, because it's really the objective of heritage legislation, and how we understand heritage is to conserve cultural significance. That is what is important or valuable about the place, and that's really bound up to questions of value, as we saw in that local heritage slide, historical interest, architectural value, and so on, or as articulated in the Borough Charter values of aesthetic, historic, scientific, social, and spiritual significance. And I quite like the idea of heritage regimes and processes, and it comes out of the work of the regimes work. I think it's really interesting work by Gabor Sonkoli, who's an Eastern European scholar, as well as Laura Jane Smith, based at the Australian National University, who looks at heritage as social process. And the ways in which all these sorts of documents and systems kind of come together to construct, in her words, the authorised heritage discourse. Now, my kind of provocation for this talk is that Australian heritage regimes based around values-based conservation may well not have the capacity or the resilience to meaningfully conserve public spaces. And so to kind of break this down, we have to say, well, values for conservation, I've spoken about a little bit already, and might be familiar to you. It's the way that practitioners guide heritage places. But then I think that public space has a distinctive challenge, particularly if we start to think of it in terms of people-centered heritage and values-based conservation. And we look at the ideas of really key scholars around public space like Kurt Iverson, Seth Lowe, and Neil Smith, who look at the ways in which public space is highly political, is linked to democracy, civil society, has political and social dimensions to them, and spaces are socially produced as well. And there's, I think, a bit of a disjuncture when heritage systems try and embed this sort of idea of public space within them. And so the case study of public space I'll be using, although I showed you a couple on the previous slide, outside the Sydney Opera House and in Perth, but the public space I'll be looking at today is Melbourne's Federation Square, which first opened in late 2002. And here's a photo from soon after it was completed by the absolutely fantastic architectural photographer, John Gollings. And you can see Federation Square here, where my mouse is, opposite St Paul's Cathedral, opposite Flinders Street Station as well, and the Young and Jackson Pub. And this is probably, I would say, the most significant and important intersection and most well-known intersection of two streets, Flinders Street and Swanston Street, in Australia. But what existed here as a sort of public space has a longer history to it, which I'll be outlining. Alongside the dispute and there'll be two heritage disputes that I talk through gradually. The first one will be between 2017 and 2019, which is about a proposal to privatise or corporatise a section of the Square and build an Apple store. And that was what I was quite heavily involved in at the time. But that wasn't the first or heritage dispute at the site, or even the most, arguably just as prominent heritage dispute occurred 2 decades earlier. And that was at the turn of the millennium over the treatment of that intersection, the Flinders Street and the Swanston Street intersection here. And the National Trust and its allies opposed the placement of this, what they called a shard, because in their words of the Trust and its allies, it would negatively impact the view lines towards the Gothic revival St Paul's Cathedral and be a detriment to the southern approach across Princes Bridge into the CBD of Melbourne. So it's very interesting then that we have this sort of dual heritage disputes. And so by talking through both of these disputes and richly contextualising this particular part of the city, I think I'm hopeful that I'll express to you the time depth of heritage, its past, but also how heritage also shapes city futures at the same time. As I said before, I became an activist and a co-convener in the more recent dispute as the Our City, Our Square campaign, which we said was for Fed Square, not Apple Square, to keep it positive. And there I am in a purple shirt. And we were successful in that campaign. And then I've subsequently done some consulting work and, of course, teaching and lecturing about Federation Square. So particularly in those 3 years between 2017, 18 and 2020, sort of lived in Federation Square. It was like this bit of an autoethnography methodologically, but also, and then I've sort of stayed interested ever since and before that too. So what is Federation Square? Well, it's a bit of a misnomer. It's kind of a square, but it's actually 7.9 acres of land. It was designed by Lab Architecture Studios It comprises cultural institutions, hospitality venues, retail stores, performance spaces, community, cultural, media and commercial offices, laneways, congregation spaces, step walkways and open areas. We can kind of say the whole thing is in a way a public space, but the most sort of charged and significant aspect of the site, at least from a public space perspective, is the civic square here, which has the video screen here on the left. And we're looking here at a display board from 96. So it has the two shards in place of the cathedral. The site changed quite a bit subsequently. Let's go a little bit further back. This location at the Princess Bridge on the northern banks of the river is significant in the longer history of Melbourne as a settler colonial city. You can see on this pre-gold rush lit up lithography is the future site of Federation Square just here. And you also notice the British flag here and soldiers and colonists claiming Indigenous Wurundjeri land, abstracting it, turning into Crown property. And in effect, we literally see the processes of colonisation on a sketch such as this. And the almost complete absence of Indigenous people, the kind of taking of their land, Enterprise Park back there where the ships are arriving, and so on. This is from 1862. The area is developed a bit, beginning of kind of fences and closing off property, the beginning here of a kind of a crematorium that existed on the site where Federation Square is, as well as the original St Paul's Cathedral before it was rebuilt. So this is the original Gothic St Paul's before William Butterfield rebuilds in the 1890s. You can also see the beginning of the rail yards and the railway terminus. So it's kind of the beginning of this sort of central civic commercial entrance point into the city. Once the railways were built into this site and it started to become so central, there are lots of proposals to create a city square over what are the Jolimont rail yards on the right here where Federation Square is. 19th and early 20th century civic idealism, unfortunately, was insufficient to overcome the proponents of free enterprise, who prioritised increased private land holdings and enhanced street circulation over a public square, which would have terminated a city street or taken over a city block. In effect, a public square is land that can't be commercialised and developed. So it's kind of a sort of a gift to the city, and developers, don't necessarily want that. So we can see these as claims for a public space in this area more than half a century before Fed Square. And this is a proposed civic square from 1940 with this kind of grand European style building that would make up the space opposite the cathedral, opposite the station. It was a proposal that was not built. Another proposal was the creation of Cathedral Square. This was a Royal Institute of Architects proposal from 1928. And again, another sort of imagining of what the city might be, and again was not built. So we see this like long history of contestation for the creation of a square in Melbourne more generally, because there wasn't one, and then specifically this being seen as the ideal site for opposite the cathedral, St Paul's Cathedral, the ideal site for that civic square. In the post-war period, there were again attempts to push for at that site for there to be some form of development, and you can see here Federation Square is currently there, so it's underneath those railway lines. They're the Jolimont rail yards. They run underneath the bridge into Flinders Street Station. So there were further proposals to do something with this site from the 50s. There was a massive project that would involve the entire demolition of the Victorian CBD and the creation of these new towers that would replace the entire city, because at this time, in the kind of the throes of modernism in the 50s and 60s, there was an idea that everything that was old was bad, everything that new was good, and what would be better than recreating the city in this sort of idealized Le Corbusier sort of way. And then as part of that, towers would be built. It would take 30 years. It will be done with Melbourne Properties Proprietary Limited. It was like the ultimate kind of expression of the sort of imagined modernist city. Of course, didn't go ahead. What did go ahead, though, was the construction of the gas and fuel towers here, which were where Federation Square is today. The air rights were originally sold over the rail yards in 1963, and these two modernist monolith towers of 18 stories in the International Star were built by Lend-Lease. They were immediately hated. They were seen as this complete eyesore, destroying access and visual amenity into the city. They certainly had a large degree of blocking off the cathedral for sure. and they were also for the state, funnily enough, for the State Electricity Commission, which is now going to be coming back. But they were, SEC was quite negatively associated with these buildings at the time. So it's funny how we've forgotten the architecture of the State Electricity Commission, although we might, there's more popularity in terms of its more broader social society aims. But let's say there was, in a sense, a redeeming feature of the gas and fuel towers, the Princess Plaza, and that was the construction, finally, of a sort of public space here, an elevated public space opposite the cathedral. Princess Plaza, it was elevated, it was unloved, but it was a sort of public gift. You could have fantastic views of the cathedral and also of Flinders Street Station. There was an arcade running underneath. To get into it, you took these stairs up. It's a bit dire, actually very windswept as well, a bit harsh and hostile platform sort of space. But hey, there was finally a kind of constructed square on that side. So that was very exciting, I suppose, for the city to get an unsuccessful public space of some kind. Just while, you know, meanwhile, there were also proposals for other sorts of squares in Melbourne, such as the Cathedral Square opposite Parliament House. So this wasn't the only site proposed, but it was certainly a major one, and it kind of gets that sort of public space in the 60s. But really, the first, I suppose, true public space that Melbourne occurs in 1980, and that was with the construction of City Square. City Square is on the other side of St Paul's Cathedral, opposite the Melbourne Town Hall, or was. And this is Queen Elizabeth opening up the City Square in 1980. You can see, also see I love this because it has the Yellow Peril, the quite famous and controversial sculpture in Melbourne that was banished and is now at Acme. Sorry, not at Acme, it's out at the Malthouse Theatre sort of area and Acker. City Square kind of lasted just over a decade. The problem with this one was this kind of Dentacorp commercial design was confusing, large, austere, impractical expanses, hard and bland spaces, and Melburnians never really embraced it. Half the square was sold off in the early 90s, and it's where the Western Hotel was built, and it's now there. The other half of City Square was kind of shut down a few years ago for the building of the Melbourne Metro Tunnel, and it's going to kind of come back as a sort of public space once the Metro Tunnel reopens. But sort of never, again, unsuccessful, just like the Princess Plaza, smaller podium space. These are some of the last photos of the gas and fuel towers prior to their demolition, viewed from the rooftop of the concert hall. You can see here, these buildings are on the move. And these were kind of demolished because they were just very unpopular. They blocked the sight lines into the city, into the cathedral. They walled off the Southern Gateway into the city, and it was seen as part of regenerating Melbourne, rebuilding Melbourne, postcode 3000, bringing people back into the city, building docklands and creating a kind of spine along the river through to the new Docklands and Renewal Precinct would require the demolition of these two buildings. As I said, there were some historic elements of them, and these are some famous vaults that existed under the gas and fuel towers and still are there today on that side of the river and part of the kind of complex. So the buildings were on the move, and it was part of this sort of civic endeavour, and the buildings kind of go. And it's with that the Victorian government of the time, the Kennett government, releases a competition for what's going to replace it. And it's decided that it's going to be kind of a truer and more successful public square and public space. And there's a design brief, and there's an architectural design competition, and there's submissions into the competition from all across Australia and all across the world. The ultimate winners of the competition are Donald Bates and Peter Davidson of Lab Architecture Studio. Bates is a Texan who was working in London and had worked with Libeskind. Daniel Libeskind is the famous architect who built the Jewish Museum and Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, most famously. And so and Peter Davidson is from Sydney, although they were both in London. And this is this kind of Federation, this kind of Libeskind-inspired postmodern deconstructivist style building. It's really just kind of a series of concrete blocks with some interesting facades and spectral facades. Although there are some quite significant engineering feats in order to build on top of the rail yards as well. And this was the original display board from the competition, where we have the Civic Square, what was going to be a rainforest greenhouse, as somewhere to walk in Melbourne's kind of chilly winters, pub and restaurant, which was built, which is transport. Down here where NGV is, NGV Australia is, which was originally going to be cinemas, exhibition galleries up here, which is where Acme where ACME is. But the big problem were these two shards in what was going to be called the support forecourt. And that's really what got the heritage community really riled up. I mean, a lot of people got riled up because the design itself was quite controversial and quite challenging, but particularly that became the kind of focus of the concerns of the site was those two shards. So this was the cover of Trust News for the render of the shard here. This kind of 1990s CAD-style architectural renders. So many people in the community found the experimental architecture challenging, but the left shard was the big problem. Debate continued for 4 years, and it was kind of constantly in the newspapers, in the Herald Sun, in the Age, ABC, and how I interpret these claims over this space is kind of a community claim for public space, but also different kind of cultural heritage claims from the community as well for this historical public space as well. But the conservationists were divided, the kind of heritage community. You had a very traditional national trust that opposed the shard, but you also had more kind of progressive sections of the community who believed that experimental design had the capacity to enhance the public realm. And I think that second position, that more kind of design progressive position, is really interesting because I think today there's a lot of people in the architecture and design community who see heritage as empowering, although there are many others who see it as sort of a statutory or governance system that's very restrictive. So there's always different perspectives within and beyond heritage too. A couple of tidbits from the newspaper. This is the one for the Melbourne Times from 2000. The displaced architects of Federation Square take shelter in a refugee camp on the outskirts of town in their kind of triangular formed tents. Crown Casino, which has been built at the time and a bit controversial on the river. There, the kind of development of the year, and you've got Bates and Davidson, imagine is hiding away. And then the kind of phone line, before social media. Do you agree with the decision to scrap one shard in Federation Square? 81% no, 19% yes. So every Melbourneian had a kind of perspective on what was happening at the time in heritage at Federation Square. After 3 or 4 years, the shard issue is eventually resolved. By that time, construction was actually already underway, and it actually gets resolved with the change of government. The Kennett Liberal government was voted out in 1999. It was kind of a promise of the incoming Bracks government that they would resolve the shard issue. They kind of tried to resolve it by saying we'll get rid of it. Then they realized it was too late to get rid of it, and then there was this kind of negotiations for a number of months while it's being built and while it was going hundreds of millions of dollars over budget in its construction costs, till eventually the end outcome is this, the Melbourne Visitor Centre. And so a sort of truce was called in the kind of, I suppose, the kind of cutting down of the shard into this smaller building here, the truncated Eastern Shard. You can't immediately see these sorts of disputes on the site or read them in, even as we see the sort of cultural value and relationships to public space in the community are made. And it's sort of as Seth Lowe and Neil Smith would say, public space is always contested, it's situational, it's under evolution, it's under dispute. And so I think that's sort of bringing that sort of contest to an end. What I think is also fascinating is when we look now, the shard was demolished very recently for the Melbourne Metro Tunnel. So after all this debate and these issues, the site it's actually demolished in itself. So with the consent of heritage authorities, the shard was demolished, I think, about 2021 for the new underground station entrance, and there'll be a new sort of Melbourne Metro Tunnel shardy sort of entrance kind of constructed. So it's kind of fascinating sort of developmental pressures in cities and how so much energy and effort went into that outcome, which only lasted 15 years anyway. This is Federation Square 5 years after completion, by which time it started to be embraced by the community and by Melburnians. I'm going to talk a bit through some heritage responses on the site and some community responses to the site. And I think this is a really interesting way of tracing the ways in which empirically historical and social value emerges for these sorts of complexes. And of course, aesthetic and architectural value emerges too, particularly because the Federation Square won a heap of architectural awards at completion. This was the eventual layout of the site. So with the NGB in this corner and the Civic Square here. Fed Square's opened in 2002. It's delayed a year due to cost overruns and complexity. Federation Square itself is a cultural heritage. It's a monument. it's a monument to celebrate the centenary of Australian Federation of 2001. So it's a deliberate creation of a civic and national monument, but it's not going to be a simple kind of sculpture or artwork that monuments have often been in the past, but it's an entire monument of an entire complex. But it's somewhat overstated in its kind of memotic or memory-based functions. It only has a few little kind of small things within it, which kind of explicitly, I suppose, related to federation and related to memory work. I think the most significant one is created by artist and academic Paul Carter called Niramu, which is a public installation across the outdoor plaza. And what this does is it embeds 9 different voices into the sandstone of the plaza itself. The maker's vision, the colonist's vision, the child's vision, the migrant's vision, and so on. There are little kind of messages. So when you walk around the site, you can kind of look up and find those sort of messages in the site. I suppose the ambition of this was to embed diverse community words into the sandstone of the plaza. And it was quite celebrated for the time. It was made of, the actual plaza itself is made of sandstone from the Great Sandy Desert, and the materials, colours and filling of the plaza were intended to evoke the Indigenous landscapes of Northwest Australia. And that's sort of where the Indigenous aspects, heritage aspects of the site ends. It was bringing in sandstone from another section of Australia. So there was no engagement with the Kulin Nations, with the Wurundjeri, because those groups didn't, there was no registered Aboriginal party or any sort of formal organisation that way. The maker's vision is sort of ambiguous in its sort of Indigenous perspective. So it's kind of quite poor in terms of engaging at the time of construction. But that also reflected, I suppose, where reconciliation and where settler colonialism was up to at the turn of the millennium. The actual techniques used to create the sandstone, I think, is quite interesting. We have Louis Trejo, so it's this kind of European, very deliberately European sort of bricklaying and European sort of laying of these sort of individual cobblestones. It was designed to look like the very famous, it was all strongly inspired by the very famous Plaza of Siena in its kind of colour and the ways it brings people in. Siena has a very famous public square, and it's fabulous. So Federation Square grows in kind of significance as a public square, and I'd say also as a heritage space over subsequent years, becoming the symbolic and civic heart of Melbourne. Many remain apprehensive about its design, but it does get embraced by citizens and tourists alike as a sort of centre of Melbourne. The first major protest at the site, really what embodies the kind of democratic ideal of a public space, is protest and dissent and alternative opinion, were the protests from 2003 against the Iraq War, and it was filled up at this time with people protesting against the invasion there. It also begins to get a more significant Indigenous aspect to it, and specifically the Koori Indigenous Heritage Trust took a lease on the site in 2015. And this was, I think, really important in terms of symbolically moving an Indigenous heritage group into the heart of the city, or they were previously on King Street as well, certainly embedding Indigenous perspectives. And the Koori Heritage Trust has brilliant Indigenous-led design, including the kind of creation of this canoe table in the middle where cultural objects are stored and presented. So I really encourage you to kind of go and check out that site, because thankfully it's still there. Federation Square is also a public space. It's managed by a government-owned corporation, the ambition of which was to profit from commercial tenancies and events. So ideally, Federation Square would turn some kind of profit, would make money, which is quite ironic for a public or cultural square that it would be required to do so, but it was, and this would as with the Koori Heritage Trust, this management aspect of the site would kind of come to the fore with the Apple dispute a few years later. A few other events we saw, it's where people go to watch the fireworks. Also other things like the Homeless World Cup in 2008. So Federation Square does have a civic and cultural charter, and that's meant to put public interests above commercial ones. And in terms of the site, it's also very interesting that more and more people are visiting every year. 10 million people visit annually eventually to the site. So there kind of is this dual purpose of trying to put cultural interests and public interests and balancing that against kind of commercial and management questions. Another one, it's used not just for celebration and protest, but also for commemoration. And this is a really beautiful installation on the site, the 5,000 Poppies project from Remembrance Day in 2014. And so you can see again, Federation Square taking on this really important role in the life of the city and taking on, I suppose, cultural significance that would eventually be recognised in a heritage way. Another aspect of it, sort of Indigenous culture and being reported into the site was the display on the screen of Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's apology to the Stolen Generation on Sorry Day in 2008. So Federation Square takes on meanings to the reconciliation, Indigenous politics and cultural life too. And as I mentioned at the start, Tanderum, which is now held every year, reviving this ancient ceremony. The Kulin Heritage Trust, as I already said before. So I'll take a pause for breath, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened in the late 2010s. So on a couple of days before Christmas, in December 2017, a press release was dropped that said the Yarra building, which houses the Koori Heritage Trust, as well as held a couple of cafes, is going to be demolished and replaced with an Apple store. This Apple store on the right, as a kind of fait accompli. And this was sort of a cookie cutter sort of Apple store design that had been used in cities across the world. And it was based on a secret deal made between the Victorian government, Federation Square management, and Apple. And this was going to be the future of the Civic Square, because we're on the Civic Square here, and the future of this public space. Apple called it Federation Square by Apple. They were literally trying to rebrand and corporatize the site. I'll play you a video. A few tourists were interviewed in a vox pop saying they weren't what's going on here about this sort of privatization and corporatization of this public space. And so the idea, and here are a few renders of a couple of different versions of the site, because it's sort of the Apple stores have kind of changed a couple of times. Would be this sort of rebranding of Apple. Apple would have a say over programming in the Civic Square, so they could refuse to allow protests to be there. Apple sales, marketing, security events were going to be involved and kind of co-managed Federation Square. And the entire process was very, there's no democratic or transparent aspect to it. It wasn't a very civic way to manage the public space. Outrage ensued in the community. And what this really showed is the way that Federation Square, despite controversies and different views on its design, had really taken on those sort of 2 decades of sort of public affection and relationship, but also over a century of public space debates and contests. And here there was the Andrews government of the time trying to, in effect, stick an Apple store in there as a sort of one of the ministers at the time, Philip Diladaka, said he can't wait to take his children one day to the Apple store at Federation Square. That's in Hanson. So it's sort of outrageous sort of comments like that, as this was the sort of manna from heaven sort of situation. Now, the Apple project did have support of tenants, including the Koori Heritage Trust and the National Gallery. So there was some meetings that did happen behind the scenes to try and get ducks in a row in terms of institutional support. And the Koori Heritage Trust was going to be moved to another part of the site, although in a less prominent position. So personally, I got involved by running a very early opinion piece for The Age, just saying that this whole thing was outrageous. And then I started talking to heritage institutions and activists and professionals about the proposal. And I was told, well, Federation Square isn't heritage, so there isn't really a cultural heritage issue. I disagreed with that. And thankfully, so did Felicity Watson at the National Trust. And then I started working with Tanya Davidge and others to launch a kind of organisation to lead a campaign around it. Now, why wasn't Federation Square heritage? Well, it was seen to be too new. And also, you could do a heritage impact statement, which could loosely favour the building of the store within the governing charter. And also, because public space wasn't cultural heritage, that was another big sort of argument put forward. But as I said, I disagreed, and thankfully there was a lot of other people from different areas, like architecture and planning, and I suppose I think the Greens in particular, and the National Trust, which thought, okay, we can have development, we can have an Apple store, but let's keep it on Burke Street or in a commercial district. Let's not give up the Civic Square for the construction of this and this unsympathetic proposal. So the square, there was lots of kind of different versions put forward as sort of the public and the community views developed, and really were very, very negative towards the site. You can see this was the second version that was designed to be a bit more sympathetic. there were said to be other benefits, like it would provide slightly easier access to the Yarra River, which has certainly been an issue that's dogged Federation Square. Sorry, this is the second version here, but not one that necessarily needed to be resolved with an Apple store. And here is the iPad style design that came out. And the idea here was that Federation Square needed more money to operate, and it could, it would manage the kind of conflicts adequately under the charter, which few people found convincing. So I'll play you another video.
A campaign will be launched in Melbourne today to challenge the construction of an Apple mega store in the city's Federation Square. Last year, the state government announced that the 15-year-old Yarra building would be demolished to make way for a new architect-designed flagship store. Community groups are angry about the commercial giant taking over public space.
So one kind of Sunday afternoon, myself and Brett Hoot and Tanya Davidge, the three of us with a couple of others, sat down and wrote a press release and gave it to all the newspapers. And suddenly we were this kind of group that existed according to the newspapers and the news. So that was just kind of sending media a press release and saying that a group has formed to oppose the Apple store. So there was lots of little kind of protests, like the kind of, why don't we just have a Bunnings in Fed Square? At least it's Australian, kind of poking fun at it. The other ones like Juice the Apple, which is this flash mob that came along to try and to juice the apple, but also connecting up with the city more broadly. Was it sort of other actions that we took?
The city will be plastered with posters urging people not to support plans for an Apple store in Federation Square. The Citizens for Melbourne group has the backing of 7 candidates for Lord Mayor who agree the development is a rotten idea.
An Apple store is a quick fix, it provides no vision for the square, and it sets a dangerous precedent for public space across Melbourne.
The Lord Mayor would have no power to block the proposal but could lobby the state government.
We kind of did these posters that let Apple poison Fed Square and raised some money from a kind of a mailing list that ended up getting up to more than 100,000 people from a series of change.org petitions and other things. And we had all these sorts of events. We had a protest at the square. You can see there, we love Fed Square. And the argument that I put forward from a public heritage perspective was that public space is something that heritage regimes and values-based conservation should be able to take custodianship of. There's no reason why it couldn't be a form of heritage. And so we had the protests, the petitions, the submissions to government, local government, state government, their broadsheets, stencils, online digital protest, crowdfunding, and then the final action was this attempt to buy back Federation Square. So I'll play to you this proposal to buy back Federation Square.
Today, our city, our square, launches a $40 million crowdfunding campaign. The idea behind this audacious plan is to raise enough money to buy this building back from Apple, because essentially the Victorian government has sold it to Apple. It might be absurd that the taxpayers have to raise their own money to buy back a building they already own, but that is the game we are now playing. Because Apple has come, swept in and done a secret deal with the government. We still don't know the details, but we think if we've got $40 million from Victorians who want this building protected, we'll be able to buy it back. A lot of Victorians...
So it was a joke, but it got a lot of media coverage. And the idea, this came out of, so in Sydney, they've done a lot of work on if the Sydney Opera House is demolished, how much would each Sydney-sider be prepared to spend in order to have the Sydney Opera House rebuilt? And so we said, well, why don't we kind of transplant that idea into Melbourne? I was having a coffee with the colleagues at Melbourne Uni, and we said, let's launch a crowdsourcing campaign, because it was, some of the last decisions were being made about the site, and that's sort of where that kind of idea came from. And this was at the same time that heritage authorities were deciding whether to, were doing some interim heritage orders and some decision making around it. And the ultimate decision at this point was that that an early heritage assessment was done that said no, the Apple store couldn't be built. And it was at that point when the heritage authorities made that preliminary assessment that Apple pulled out. So the state government managed to save face. Our campaign sort of won. We didn't know if they'd come back and make a second kind of stab once the heritage listing went through, which it eventually did. but they didn't. And I suppose the sort of reputational impacts of this project. There was also a project in Stockholm that we were connected with, which they were trying to take over a public park, and a few other things meant that this sort of strategy of Apple trying to insert itself within civic culture starts to kind of fade away, and they replace the head of Apple retail at that time. I love cartoons, so here are a few cartoons. Apple Wrecking Ball, the Corrigan House, the castle. People rejected building an Apple store here, so we need to come up with an iconic architectural alternative, because at the time the Corrigan House from the famous movie The Castle was being relocated. This timber structure, why not put that in Fed Square? Apple being tax avoidant, the ATO sort of sign here. And finally, where's Jack Mundy when you need him? Jack Mundy being the initiator of the Green Bands in Sydney and the Heritage Group, this sort of activist group in the 1970s and 80s that saved huge swaths of Melbourne and Sydney. So the official nomination comes from the National Trust of the State Heritage Register, and eventually it does get listed. There was a big fight and debate over whether public space was a class of a sort of object that could be heritage listed. Those representing Apple said it couldn't be listed as a public space, but eventually the Heritage Council thankfully rejected that development, and the Civic Square as well was given particular protections. So you've got a registration review document from April 2019. When it enters heritage regimes, it does get protected. An article from The Age at that time by Clay Lucas, with Fed Square added to State's Heritage Register just 17 years after opening. The square has divided opinions since 2002, but debate over its future ignited in 2017 after they would allow the demolition for an Apple store, but now it has been listed. It enters heritage regimes and the heritage system. Eventually, a conservation management plan was produced by Lovell Chen for Federation Square, and I did a bit of work on this. And it has a whole lot of really interesting strategies and policies for the site. I think the next kind of big victory for the site too was that the Federation Square management was disbanded, and it was taken into a new organisation called the Melbourne Cultural Precinct, which also involved National Gallery and Acme and a range of other kind of cultural sites. And so it was this recognition that Federation Square was a cultural site and a cultural asset and should be managed by cultural managers and arts people, and shouldn't be managed by corporate people anymore or have such a corporate focus in it and will be corporatized. And so that happened a couple of years later more quietly. So between the heritage listing, between the Apple permit rejection, followed by the heritage listing, followed by the reformulation of the site, really represented a victory for people power, and I think a victory for heritage as well. But what still I think remains to be seen is whether heritage conservation will in the future be able to meaningfully conserve the cultural significance of public space for people and society. And so if public space is a new frontier of cultural heritage, do we need to rethink ideas and practices of heritage to be meaningfully part of the conservation and debate? Crucially, the built fabric, the historic fabric of the built environment of Fed Square is quite secure, but who knows what would happen with the Civic Square? Who knows what could happen with future tenancies in the future at the site? What might be there? And so we're really asking the question, can the social, political, urban and cultural significance of public spaces in the future continue to be holistically managed within actually existing values-based conservation? Okay, that's the lecture.